Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. This video is a video that will examine certain key theological controversies between covenant theology, that's Reformed covenant theology, and New Covenant theology. It's a part of my larger playlist called New Covenant Theology, in which I examine three theological systems, all of which are designed to answer the perplexing question: what is the relationship between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? I think the New Covenant theology has the answer. In order to explain New Covenant theology, I've made 6 videos to explain covenant theology and 9 videos to explain dispensationalist theology, and I've exposed all the weaknesses in those two systems, I think, as I've gone through those 15 videos. And now I'm trying to explain what New Covenant theology is. I hope you enjoy it. All right, this is the outline of my PowerPoints. I've got 2 major PowerPoints I'm going to use to go through this series of videos on New Covenant theology. I've given an overview of the NCT system. I've talked about how there's so many things in the Bible that were old and have become new, old and living, new and living way. Old Covenant becomes New Covenant, Old Israel becomes New Israel, Old Jerusalem becomes New Jerusalem, and over again. Then it creates quite an impressive pattern. I've talked about implications of believing covenant theology or dispensational theology, and most of those implications are quite negative. I've looked at the physical and spiritual fulfillments of Abraham's promises, the land and offspring and blessing promises, and I've shown that they were fulfilled physically in the Old Testament and spiritually fulfilled in the church. There's no need to fulfill them in a future millennium. And now let's look at some controversies between covenant theology and New Covenant theology. I'm going to look at 3, the first of which is Matthew 5:17 through 19. Then we're going to look at the question, are Old Testament commands still valid? Since New Covenant theology people believe that the law of Moses has been abrogated. And then we're going to look at this controversial threefold division of the law that reformers always use: civil, ceremonial, and moral. So let's look at Matthew 5:17 through 19. As I go through this, what I'm going to try to point out to you is that the verse on its surface seems embarrassing to New Covenant theology and supportive of covenant theology. I'm going to show to you that that is not the case. So let's just read it here. Matthew 5:17 through 19. Do not think, Jesus said, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, I think you can see on the surface this seems to provide a difficulty for New Covenant theology. In fact, I've always thought that when you adopt or reject a theological system, the best thing to do is to look at the weak spots in the system to see if it can defend well. I think that New Covenant theology can defend quite well this difficult passage. Let's take it verse by verse, starting with Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets, Jesus said. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Well, right there, Jesus has not come to abolish the law. That's Moses' law, and isn't that what New Covenant theology says? That the law is not, that the Mosaic law has been abolished and replaced by the New Covenant law of Christ? Ooh, that is embarrassing to us, is it not? And furthermore, Jesus says, I have come to fulfill the law. And if you take fulfill in the way that the Reformed covenant theologians do, they say fulfill means to establish. I've come to establish the law. And so the law is here. It has not been abrogated. And by golly, NCT people are wrong when they say that the Mosaic law has been abrogated. Well, here again are the problems for NCT, New Covenant theology. Doesn't Jesus establish the law by fulfilling it? As I said, that's what the Reformed covenant people say. Well, here's the answer to that from an NCT viewpoint. What happens to a contract when it's fulfilled? It's abolished. If I agree to sell you a cell phone for $500 and you agree to pay me $500. I deliver the cell phone to you, and you deliver the money to me. That contract is completely abolished. It's gone. It's void. It's null. It's unenforceable. It's terminated. Now, that doesn't mean it was evil. It served its purpose while it was in effect. It was a good contract. It was holy and just. But by golly, it's abolished now. So that's a relatively easy answer, easy defense for New Covenant theology. But what about this phrase here? I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets. Well, here's the solution to that from an NCT viewpoint. Before the cross, Jesus indeed did not come to abolish the law. And when was Jesus talking here in Matthew 5:17? He was talking before the cross, before the church was established. Now, he did fulfill and abolish the law after the cross. He did do that. But we're not after the cross now, are we? We're before the cross when Jesus is speaking. So, and again, I'm sure Jesus was trying to defend himself against the Pharisees' phony charges that he was anti-Moses. He was not anti-Moses. He lived under the law of Moses. That was not a problem. But the thing is, he was coming to abolish that law because he was the new lawgiver. He hadn't set it up yet. He hadn't done it yet because he had died on the cross and rose from the dead and come back in the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. He hadn't done all that yet. But when he did do all that, then the law would be abolished. But right now, as he defends himself from the Pharisees against their erroneous charges that he was against Moses, he was saying, look, I didn't come to abolish Moses. So I think New Covenant theology answers that problem quite well. Now let's go to the next verse in our problem passage here, Matthew 5:17 through 19. Matthew 5:18 says this, "For truly," Jesus says, "I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished." Oh, another embarrassing verse for NCT. It sounds like the law is unabolished after the cross. I just said that Jesus came to fulfill the law before the cross, but after the cross he was going to abolish the law. But after the cross, until heaven and earth pass away, did not heaven and earth still exist after the cross? So therefore Jesus could not have done away with the law. Does this verse not say that the law will not be done away until the end of time? And therefore New Covenant theology is wrong from the get-go? If we interpret heaven and earth passing away at the end of the earth, that does destroy New Covenant theology, no question. Well, here's some solutions to defend for New Covenant theology. First solution is that this phrase, until heaven and earth pass away, is Hebrew hyperbole, extreme exaggeration. And the verse should be read this way. Heaven and earth would disappear. Oh, that, of course, is not going to happen before Jesus abolished and fulfilled the law at the cross. In other words, there ain't no way that Jesus is going to abolish the law before the cross, because heaven and earth is not going to pass away before the cross. And that's not going to happen, so the law's not going to pass away. And I think that answers it. However, there's an interesting argument that I picked up by reading David Chilton's commentary on Revelation. And ironically, David Chilton is a theonomist, reformed to the max, totally anti-New Covenant. However, in a different context, Chilton said that heaven and earth was a rabbinic phrase referring to the Jewish kingdom. Now, I don't know what his research is on that or his scholarship is on that, and one day I'd like to check it out. But if this is true, then what this verse would be saying, "For truly I say to you, until the old Jewish order passes away, not an iota dot will pass from the law. But by golly, when AD 70 comes and the Jewish order, Jewish rabbinic Pharisaical order is destroyed by the Romans, then the law will pass away." I think that's very intriguing. I'd like to research that sometime. But either way, New Covenant theology can answer this apparently embarrassing verse. Now, look at this accomplished in green here. Not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. What does accomplished mean? Well, you know, some people take that as accomplished means at the end of the world. But I think what Jesus was talking about was until all is accomplished on the cross. Remember when he said, "It is finished, it is accomplished, it is done"? It means when he takes the sins of the world on him, that means he is established as the new lawgiver. The law of Christ is established right there. And that's when all the iotas and all the dots of the law will pass away, when everything is accomplished, when he dies on the cross. So you see there, New Covenant theology can safely navigate these apparently controversial and embarrassing verses. Now, I'd also like to point out to you that this verse is also embarrassing for your typical Reformed people, because it says, not an iota, not a dot will pass away till heaven and earth pass away. And if you take it like the Reformed people do most of the time, they say it means at the end of the world. Not an iota, not a dot will pass away. Does that mean we stone homosexuals, stone rebellious children? Do we not have linen and cotton mixed together in our shirts? Do we we cannot plant peas and tomatoes in the same garden plot? Is that what it means? Well, the way the Reformers get around that, they say, well, this is talking about the moral aspect of the law. They divide the law into three parts: civil, ceremonial, and moral. And they say, until the end of the world, until all is accomplished at the end of the world, not one jot or tittle of the moral law will pass away. But that is not what Jesus said to Matthew. He said, not an iota, not a dot of the law. Didn't say from the moral law. He said from the law. And that includes all those civil and ceremonial things that will not pass away. So we're still going to sacrifice animals until the end of time? So you see, it's not only New Covenant Theology people have a problem with this verse, but Reform do too. They're going to have to rely on that civil, ceremonial, and moral division of the law, which we'll look at in just a minute. And they have trouble doing that. I've even found, I remember listening to a podcast by a famous Reformed scholar, Richard Gaffin, who said, I think it was Richard Gaffin, I'm pretty sure it was, who said, we got to give up on that. That's too hard a case to make. All right. And what I just said is summarized again here in this slide here. The problem for Reformed, if accomplished, is at the end of the world. Not an iota, not a dot will pass away. That means the judicial laws are in effect, so we should stone rebellious children. We should allow polygamy and slavery until the end of the world. No, I don't think so. So I think it makes much more sense to say that accomplished is not at the end of the world, but on the cross, and not one iota, not a dot of all the law. Don't divide the law up. All of it's going to be in effect until Jesus dies on the cross. All right, let's look at Matthew 5:19. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments, Jesus says to his audience, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Oh, so here's our problem for New Covenant Theology. Does New Covenant Theology advocate the relaxing of the law of Moses? The Reformed Covenant theologian will say, see there, you guys are abrogating Moses. And abrogating is even worse than relaxing the law of Moses. And so now you NCT people should be called least in the kingdom of heaven. I mean, they wouldn't say it that baldly probably, but that's the flow of the logic. Well, here's the answer to that. The law of Christ is stricter than the law of Moses. NCT theologians do not relax the commandments of Moses. They don't relax them. They make them stricter. For example, Moses prohibited murder. Jesus prohibits anger. Moses prohibits adultery. Jesus prohibits even looking at a woman to lust after her. Now, the Reformers have an answer to this, and we're going to cover that in a future video when I get to my next PowerPoints. It's an interesting discussion of this, but let's just say for right now that New Covenant theologians do not pretend to relax the law of Moses. They say the law of Christ is stricter than the law of Moses, and so this charge does not affect them. All right, let's look at our second controversy with the Reformed Covenant theologians. Are the Old Testament commands still valid? Now, of course, Reformed people, Covenant people say, yes, they're still valid because there's no change in the covenants as we go from old to new. It's all a part of the so-called man-made theological covenant of grace. There's just a change of administration of this covenant of grace. I'm tempted to say mythical covenant of grace, but I'll try to be polite. So let's look at that. Are the Old Testament commands still valid? Now, here's the basic New Covenant theology position on that. The only Old Testament commands we must obey are the ones that are repeated in the New Testament. So when the New Testament reappropriates those Old Testament commands, well, then it's a part of the law of Christ, and we obey them. I think this is similar to how legal systems bar laws. I mean, how much of the modern civil law was borrowed from the Roman law, the civil law in modern European countries, in Germany, in China even? A lot of Chinese laws in that communist country came from Roman laws. And from Justinian's Code, how many American laws were borrowed from the English common law, or Australian laws, or Canadian laws? Different legal systems bar laws all the time. Now, that doesn't mean citizens in those legal systems are under the laws that were barred from, but it does mean their legal system barred from those laws. Just because Jesus barred laws from the Old Testament doesn't mean that the Old Testament laws still have jurisdiction over us anymore. It just means they were good laws for their time, and Jesus thought they would be good laws for the new age, in the age of the new covenant, and so therefore he appropriated them. Either Jesus or his apostles did. Now, there are many, many such Old Testament commands that were carried over into the New Covenant. For example, 9 of the 10 commandments were, not the Sabbath, but everything else was. So New Covenant theology is hardly antinomian, as the Reformers love to say. Now here's the problem with the Reformed position. The Reformed Christians say, the Reformed Covenant theologians say Christians must obey the 10 commandments. That's the moral law. But the Reformed don't obey the 4th commandment. They honor a Sunday Sabbath, not a Saturday. This is the chink in the Reformed honor position. I remember listening to a New Covenant theology tape at a conference, the Bunyan Conference, put on by John Riesinger. And somebody at the conference said that he was sitting in a Reformed teacher's seminary class, and he was going on and on and on about how great the Old Testament law was and how it affects Christians today. And the student raised his hand. He said, "What about the Sabbath?" And the professor said, "Well, we'll just bracket that off and consider that later," and just kind of poo-pooed it and went, because it's embarrassing to them. And even, first of all, they move the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and even then they don't obey the Sunday Sabbath. How do they enforce it? Oh, really? Well, let's see. The pastor works real hard on Sunday, and some Presbyterian Reformed Covenant theologian types, they watch football games. Sometimes they'll cut the grass. They can't enforce it. They just leave it up to everybody's individual conscience, which sounds sort of antinomian to me. All right, now, one example that the covenant theologians could show where there was something that was forbidden in the Old Testament but not forbidden in the New Testament, that would destroy New Covenant theology. For example, a moral act that was prohibited in the Old Testament but was not forbidden in the New Testament, that would allow Christians to sin, according to the Reformed Christians. But there is no such example. The example they love to use is bestiality. Oh, but the Old Testament forbade bestiality and the New Covenant does not. The simple answer to that is the New Covenant forbade sexual immorality, porneia, sexual immorality, which includes pornography, bestiality, polygamy, whatever. There's all kinds of things that porneia, incest, porneia forbids all kinds of immoral acts, including bestiality. And you could turn the same thing around to the Reformed theologian and say, well, look, the Old Testament doesn't prohibit excessive gambling. It doesn't prohibit matricide, the murder of your mother. Of course, the Old Testament law does prohibit murder, and matricide and patricide are subsets of that murder. And so, you reason from the case law to a general principle. You have to do that with every legal system. And so New Covenant theologians point their finger a lot of times at, I meant to say Covenant theologians point their finger, not New Covenant theologians, at the New Testament and say, well, you can't find where it says that you're not supposed to get drunk. Well, actually, you can find that. You can't find a prohibition against bestiality. That's the one they love. Listen, how much common sense and reading the New Testament, if you never had the Old Testament, you never heard of it, and you read the New Testament, do you really think that New Testament would allow you to have sex with a dog or a donkey? Do you really think that? That's absurd. So this is a bogus charge against New Covenant theology. All right, let's look at the third controversy that arises between New Covenant theology and covenant theologians. Is there a threefold division of the law? Now, the Reformers, and this is in the Westminster Confession of Faith, divide the law into the civil law, the ceremonial law, and the moral law. The civil law consists of laws against murder, rape, and robbery, which are typical. All law codes have that. Basically, we would call it criminal law today, but it's basically civil law. It governs society. Then we have the ceremonial law, which sets up the types of sacrifices which pointed to Christ. Those are laws regulating ritual sacrifices. And then we have the moral law, which is God's law written on the hearts of men. Now, many Reformed people say that moral law was stamped into Adam's heart. It was, and then it was given at the Mosaic covenant, and then it passes on into the new covenant. And God's moral law is the same all the way through. And of course, I do believe that God's moral law stays the same, but it's expressed in different covenants, including the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And we can't say just because the same God's moral law is behind all these different covenants that the covenants are still in effect. That doesn't follow. All right. Now, why is this distinction so important to covenant theologians, civil, ceremonial, and moral? Well, because it allows the covenant Reformed theologians to do two contradictory things. First of all, they can set Christians free from the law. They say, yeah, Paul says you're free from the law, you're free from the law. He says it in Romans, he says it in Galatians. Well, what law is Paul talking about? Well, he's talking about the civil and ceremonial law. We don't have to offer sacrifices anymore. We don't have to stone rebellious children anymore. But by golly, we are under the law, the moral law, because we don't want to be antinomian. And that's kind of the way they think and the way they operate. So you see, this is crucial to their theological system, this distinction. But what if the distinction is not valid? Then they got trouble. Now, here's some problems with the distinction. First of all, the New Testament scriptures unify the three divisions. Here's a quote from well-known evangelical scholar F.F. Bruce. Quote, again, it is sometimes said that Christ is the end of the ceremonial law. I would amend that to say it is always said by reformers that Christ is the end of the ceremonial law. This has no place in Pauline exegesis. It has to be read into Paul, for it is not a distinction that Paul himself makes. No, it is not. It is a distinction that covenant theologians make, but there is nowhere in the scriptures, Old Testament or New Testament, that there is a distinction between the civil, ceremonial, and the moral law. This is F.F. Bruce was quoted in his book, Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free. Now, let's look at some New Testament scriptures which unify the three divisions of the law. Here's James chapter 2, verse 10, a key verse. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point, civil, ceremonial, moral. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it, civil, ceremonial, and moral. You're accountable for all of it. All you got to do is mess up one thing. That's for people who are under the law. We're not under the law, thank goodness. We're not under the Mosaic law. We're not under the civil, ceremonial, or moral aspects of the Mosaic law. We're under the law of Christ, which has plenty of morality for all of us. So covenant theologians say we are free from only 2/3 of the law and subject to 1/3 of it. Now, applying Occam's razor to this proposition, the simplest solution is usually the best. And when you come up with fancy explanations to deal with a difficulty in your system, the fancy explanations are likely wrong. The simplest explanation is likely to be right. The simplest explanation is to say we're under all of the law. Every Jew was under the law before Jesus died, but after he died, all Christians are under the law of Christ. Continuing with the problems that this threefold division of the law, which is accomplished by covenant theologians, what's the problem with this, dividing the law into civil, ceremonial, and moral? Well, even covenant theologians can't do it. They don't know exactly what the moral law is when you look at the Old Testament. Now, these are covenant theologians, not new covenant theologians. These are people who generally are in favor of this division, which is written into the Westminster Confession of Faith, that they are civil, ceremonial, and moral laws. But here's what John M. Frame, if anybody who is familiar with Reformed theologians knows that he's a big one. He's extremely eminent in the Reformed world. This is what he says. What we call, quote-unquote, moral laws are mixed together in the text, almost randomly, it seems, with civil and ceremonial laws. Literal and non-literal applicability is a matter of degree, so we may expect some gray areas, quote-unquote, some laws that do not fit neatly into categories. Well, here. In my third Covenant Theology video in this playlist, I give some examples in Exodus, a passage of the law where the moral, ceremonial, and civil laws are all randomly mixed together, just like John Frame says they are. You can look at that if you're interested in further detail here. But I think this quote is enough to show that you can't divide the moral law out from the civil and ceremonial law. It just doesn't work. All right, go to let's look at another quote from another eminent Reformed scholar. This is Willem A. Van Gemeren. I think he's at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois. He says this, quote, "The moral laws, i.e. those reflected in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments, are intertwined with the civil laws, penal code, and ceremonial laws. They're intertwined. They're all mixed together. How do you separate them out? It's real hard to do. In fact, you can't do it." So what are the implications of this? If you cannot divide the civil, ceremonial, and moral law out from each other in the Mosaic law, then the implications are this. You either have to adopt one or two extreme views of theology dealing with the connection of the Old and New Covenant. You can either become a theonomist and say the whole law is in effect all the way until the end of time, as in Matthew 5, or you can say the whole law is in effect until all is accomplished on the cross, as in Matthew 5:19, according to NCT, New Covenant Theology. Well, I don't think that anybody is really going to buy into theonomy. I know a few smart people do, but most reformers don't. They abhor it. And so they are left with an embarrassing situation. Either they've got to make this distinction, which their own theologians say is very difficult to make, or they have to buy into New Covenant theology and just abandon this idea that the Old Testament Mosaic law is still in effect for today. It's a bad situation for the Reformed theologians, in my opinion. That's one reason why I have rejected Reformed theology, covenant theology, and have adopted New Covenant theology. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time.